Official history draws a hard line. Vikings reached one windswept camp on the edge of Newfoundland and went no further. That line has held for over 50 years. Taught in every textbook, defended in every department. Nobody is supposed to question it. But buried beneath a Minnesota farm in 1898, a slab of gray-wacky stone surfaced carrying runic writing and a date. 1362. It described Norse explorers deep in the American interior 660 years ago. For over a century, the academic world has called it a forgery, and for over a century, it has refused to disappear. In the last 5 years, environmental DNA pulled from lake sediment in the upper Midwest has returned genetic markers that do not belong to any population known to have lived there, and the layer they sit in dates to exactly the window the Viking sagas describe. Here is the evidence the establishment has spent a century trying to bury. To understand why the Minnesota evidence is so threatening, you first have to understand where the official line currently sits. The only place in North America where the academic world has formally agreed that Norse explorers set foot is a windswept stretch of coastline at the very northern tip of Newfoundland, a place called Meadows. Excavations there began in the 1960s, led by Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Stein. What they pulled out of the turf rewrote the textbooks immediately. Beneath layers of soil and grass lay the outlines of 8 separate buildings. Halls, workshops, outbuildings. Their layout did not echo anything native to the Americas. They echoed the halls of Greenland and Iceland, built in a specific sod longhouse tradition found nowhere else on this continent. The artifacts left no room for argument. Ring-headed bronze pins of the kind worn to fasten Norse cloaks, spindle whorls used in textile work, fragments of iron nails, and in one of the outbuildings, something extraordinary. A bloomer furnace, heaps of iron slag. The unmistakable evidence that whoever lived there was not just passing through. They were smelting iron from local bog ore, repairing ships, making tools. This was a working camp, equipped, organized, and fully operational. Then in 2021, in a study published in the journal Nature, an international team pinpointed the exact year. Their method was remarkable. In 993 AD, a massive solar storm deposited a sudden burst of radioactive carbon into the atmosphere. Trees everywhere on Earth absorbed that radiation into the rings they grew the following year. The researchers found 3 pieces of wood from Larsson Meadows, all cut with metal blades that the indigenous population did not possess, and all showing the solar storm signal exactly 28 growth rings in from the bark. The conclusion was unambiguous. The trees were felled in the year 1021 AD, 471 years before Columbus. None of that is disputed by anyone. Not the buildings, not the artifacts, not the date. Every serious archaeologist on the planet accepts Meadows as a genuine Norse site. What is disputed fiercely and continuously is the next question, the one the establishment has spent 50 years refusing to seriously ask. Because for all the material the Norse left behind at that site, there was something conspicuously, almost suspiciously, absent. No graves, no cemeteries, almost no personal items, no evidence of women living there in any significant numbers, no evidence of children, no evidence, in short, of a colony. The archaeologist Birgitta Wallace, who spent decades excavating the site for Parks Canada, has been clear about what it actually was. A base, a seasonal outpost, a place to repair ships, smelt iron, and prepare for the next leg of a journey. The settlers stayed for somewhere between 3 and 10 years, and then they left. Think about what that description actually implies. You do not cross an ocean in a wooden ship, build a forge, smelt iron, and repair vessels at the edge of an unknown continent because you intend to sit on the beach for a decade. You do that because you are going further. And the rivers that lay beyond that camp stretched thousands of kilometers into a continent the Norse were perfectly equipped to enter. Start with the motive, because it is not complicated. The Norse settlers in Greenland were not living comfortably. Their homeland was stripped of tall timber. Game was scarce. The The growing season was brutally short. Everything they needed to build ships, repair tools, and survive another winter had to come from somewhere else, and the only direction with genuine abundance was west. Forests, furs, iron-rich bog ore, a continent full of everything Greenland simply could not provide. Now look at the technology, because this is where the official story begins to fall apart entirely. The Viking longship was one of the most versatile vessels ever built in the ancient world. Its draft, the depth of water it needed to float, was less than 1 meter. Let that detail settle for a moment. A vessel capable of crossing the open North Atlantic could also glide up shallow rivers, hug winding banks, and slip across lakes that would have grounded any deeper ship. And when the water ran out, the Norse did not turn back. They carried their boats overland. The technique was called portage, rolling vessels on logs, hauling them by hand across narrow divides between one waterway and the next. This was not a desperate improvisation invented on the spot somewhere in North America. This was a standard skill, honed over centuries of actual practice. The Norse traders and warriors known as the Varangians had spent generations threading shallow draft ships through the rivers of Russia and Eastern Europe. They had moved cargo from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea across thousands of kilometers of inland water, through rapids and forests and portages, long before anyone ever set sail for North America. The skill set required to reach Minnesota by river was already in their blood. Now look at the geography itself, because the routes were not hypothetical. They were real, physical waterways, and both of them were well within the technical reach of a Norse crew. The first began at Hudson Bay. In the right season, when the ice cleared, a longship could enter the bay directly from the Atlantic. From there, the Nelson River flows south into Lake Winnipeg, a vast natural crossroads sitting in the middle of the continent. From Lake Winnipeg, the Red River winds further south, directly toward the Minnesota border and into the watershed of the Mississippi. The second route led down the St. Lawrence River through the Great Lakes and into Lake Superior. Portages linked these massive inland seas to rivers that drained south and west, offering access to nearly every corner of the upper Midwest. Here is the detail that should make the skeptics genuinely uncomfortable. French voyageurs would later paddle almost identical routes, in birchbark canoes, following trails that Indigenous nations had mapped and maintained for generations before any European ever arrived. If 17th century Frenchmen could travel these exact waterways in boats made of bark, the idea that 11th century Norsemen could not travel them in ships specifically designed for shallow water and overland portage becomes extraordinarily difficult to defend with a straight face. The motive was real, the technology was proven, the routes were physically there, waiting, and the climate itself, during the exact window the sagas describe, was actively helping. Tree rings and ice cores confirm that during the medieval warm period, the North Atlantic grew warmer, sea ice shrank, summers lengthened, and inland rivers ran higher than at any other point in the last 2,000 years. The land itself was more open to long-distance travel than it had been in a millennium, and the Norse were already at the door. On a farm outside the small town of Kensington, in western Minnesota, a Swedish immigrant named Olof Ohman was clearing stumps in the autumn of 1898 when he pulled a slab of greywacke stone from the roots of a poplar tree. Carved across its face, in careful rows of angular symbols, was a message written in runes, the old alphabet of Scandinavia. The inscription described 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on a journey of exploration west from Vinland. It told of a fishing camp, a return to find 10 men red with blood and dead, and a closing prayer. Ave Maria, save us from evil. The date carved into the stone was 1362, 660 years ago. Copies of the inscription were sent to scholars in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The response came back fast, and it came back unanimous. Fraud. The grammar was wrong. The rune forms looked modern rather than medieval. Within months, the entire academic world had closed the case and moved on. And then the stone refused to die. Ohman never sold it. People offered him money, and he turned every one of them down. Instead, he flipped the carved face downward and used it as a stepping stone outside his granary door. For years, farm boots scraped across its surface every single morning. That is not the behavior of a man protecting a carefully constructed hoax, and it is not the behavior of a man who understood what he was holding either. Here is where honesty requires stating the strongest evidence against the stone directly. Researchers later traced the runestone's unusual, non-standard runic alphabet to a set of documents called the Larsson Papers, a Swedish tailor's notebook from the 1880s listing rune forms that match the Kensington inscription almost letter for letter. The notebook was traced to a parish with a direct family connection to Ohman himself. Ohman also owned Swedish books containing a medieval prayer reading almost identically to the AVM inscription on the stone. His close friend, Sven Fogelblad, a defrocked pastor, reportedly knew runes and resented the university men who looked down on immigrant farmers. Motive, opportunity, materials. All of it lines up in a way that makes any honest investigator genuinely uncomfortable. And yet, the geology has never fully cooperated with the forgery verdict. Newton Winchell, Minnesota's state geologist, broke from the unanimous rejection in 1910, arguing the weathering inside the carved grooves looked centuries old rather than freshly cut. More recently, forensic geologist Scott Wolter studied mineral degradation rates inside the carving itself and concluded the inscription had been weathering for far longer than a decade. His methodology has been challenged, and those challenges deserve real attention. But the geological question has simply never been settled with the same finality the linguists claimed in 1899. A new three-dimensional imaging of the rune carvings themselves, work being conducted in collaboration with researchers at Uppsala University in Sweden, is producing data the original 19th century verdict never had access to. The tools that condemned this stone as a forgery were the tools of 1899. They have never been fully retested with the tools of today. The academic world stopped looking the moment the first linguist said no. The stone kept sitting there anyway, waiting for somebody to look again. The Kensington Runestone was never the only physical object suggesting Norse presence deep inside the continent. Other artifacts have surfaced across the upper Midwest, and while none of them alone carries the same dramatic weight as a carved stone bearing a date and a prayer, taken together they form a pattern that becomes increasingly difficult to explain away as pure coincidence. Start with the most securely documented find. In 1957, at a Native American archaeological site in Maine, a small silver coin was recovered from the soil. It was identified as an 11th century Norwegian penny, minted during the reign of King Olaf Kyrre, who ruled Norway from 1067 to 1093. This is the only pre-Columbian Norse artifact ever found at an indigenous site anywhere in North America, and its authenticity has never been seriously disputed by anyone. The honest counter-argument deserves to be stated directly because it is a reasonable one. The coin could have traveled through indigenous trade networks, passing from hand to hand for generations, potentially crossing enormous distances before settling into the Maine soil where it was eventually found. It does not require a single Norse foot to have physically touched that specific ground. Trade networks among indigenous nations were extensive, well-documented, and fully capable of moving a small exotic object hundreds or even thousands of miles from wherever it originally entered the continent. That is a legitimate explanation, but notice what it actually concedes. It concedes that a genuine Norse object entered the continent and traveled deep into indigenous hands. The debate is not about whether Norse material reached the interior. It is about how it got there. Beyond the Maine Penny, Norse-style iron axes and metal tools have been reported from fields and riverbanks across Minnesota and Wisconsin. Most of these finds lack the rigorous provenance documentation that modern archaeology demands before treating any individual artifact as genuine medieval material. Without that documentation, it remains genuinely difficult to separate a real 14th century Norse tool from a later European trade object brought inland centuries afterward by French or English settlers. That limitation is real, and pretending otherwise would not serve this story honestly. But notice something else. The absence of documentation is not the same thing as the absence of the objects themselves. Many of these finds were pulled from the ground decades ago by farmers and amateur collectors who had no reason and no training to document exactly where and how deep each object was found. The evidence was handled carelessly. That does not mean it was fabricated. And then there is a category of evidence the academic world has spent most of the last century ignoring almost entirely. Indigenous oral traditions from Dakota and Ojibwe communities describe strangers arriving by water long before the French or English ever appeared. Some accounts speak specifically of pale-skinned visitors carrying unfamiliar tools, their boats moving silently along the rivers. These memories, passed down through generations, do not name the newcomers. They do not provide dates, but they have been consistent, and they have been present in the oral record for far longer than any modern researcher has been willing to seriously engage with them. For most of the 20th century, mainstream archaeology dismissed these accounts exactly the way it dismissed the Vinland sagas, called them folklore. Charming local tradition, nothing more. The sagas turned out to be pointing at something real. The question now is whether these oral histories are doing exactly the same thing. But none of this, not the coin, not the tools, not the oral traditions, could ever meet the standard the field demands for genuinely rewriting history. That standard requires something considerably harder to dismiss. It requires DNA. In a university laboratory far from the riverbanks of Minnesota, a researcher named Dr. Goodman examines a vial of sediment pulled from a forgotten oxbow lake in the upper Midwest. The sample is dark with ancient silt, unremarkable to the naked eye, but inside that mud sits something no previous generation of researchers ever had the tools to look for. Every living creature sheds DNA constantly. Skin cells flake off, hair falls, saliva, waste, microscopic fragments of biological material drop to the ground with every step, every breath, every moment of physical contact with the surrounding environment. All of it gets carried by wind and rain into the nearest body of water, where it sinks to the bottom and settles into the mud. In cold, undisturbed lake sediment, that genetic material can be preserved for thousands of years, sitting exactly where it landed, layered in careful chronological order, waiting for someone with the right equipment to finally come along and read it. The technique is called metagenomic sequencing. It allows researchers to extract and identify genetic material from environmental samples, reading a kind of biological diary of who walked near that water and roughly when. Think of it as forensic science applied not to a crime scene, but to an entire landscape, pulling fingerprints out of samples that look like nothing more than ordinary mud. Dr. Goodman's team sequenced millions of individual genetic fragments from their lake sediment samples. The overwhelming majority belonged exactly where you would expect them to belong: indigenous lineages, local animal populations, plant material consistent with the known ecology of the region across the relevant time period. And then, buried among those millions of sequences, they found a handful of markers that did not belong at all. Low-frequency Scandinavian haplogroups, genetic signatures characteristic of medieval northern European populations. They were rare in the sample, faint, almost washed away by centuries of genetic mixing and the overwhelming presence of indigenous lineages surrounding them on every side. But they were present, and the layer they were buried in dated to the medieval warm period between roughly 950 and 1250 of the Common Era. That window of dates matters enormously. It is precisely the window in which the Vinland sagas describe Norse expeditions to North America. It is the window in which Meadows was confirmed active. It is the window in which tree rings and ice cores show the North Atlantic growing warmer, sea ice shrinking, summers lengthening, and the inland river routes opening wider than at any other point in the last 2,000 years. The land itself was more accessible to long-distance travelers during that exact stretch of time than it had been in a millennium. Dr. Goodman has refused to call her findings a declaration. She has called them a question. Her team has rerun every control. They have compared their samples against upstream and downstream sites. They have checked for modern contamination. They have checked for genetic mixing from later European settlement in the 1800s. The signals are faint enough that any honest scientist has to admit the possibility of error. The standard for rewriting 1,000 years of accepted history is high. It requires a Norse burial, a sealed camp, a datable artifact paired with unmistakable Scandinavian DNA in undisturbed soil. None of those have yet been found in Minnesota. But here is what has genuinely changed. This is no longer a fringe inquiry. It is happening in peer-reviewed laboratories with peer-reviewed techniques, by researchers whose entire professional reputations depend on getting the science right. And the results, however faint, are sitting in exactly the right layer, in exactly the right place. So why has the academic world resisted this story for so long? The answer is not purely scientific. It is also political, and it is genuinely uncomfortable to say out loud. Start with the politics. The Kensington Runestone surfaced in 1998 at the absolute peak of Scandinavian immigration into the American Midwest. Thousands of Swedes and Norwegians were arriving in Minnesota every single year. They were building churches, breaking sod, raising families, and looking for a sense of belonging in a country that did not always welcome them warmly. The Runestone offered something powerful to those communities, an artifact suggesting their ancestors had been on this land first, centuries before the English, centuries before the French, centuries before Columbus himself. Mainstream scholars watching that enthusiasm unfold became suspicious, not just of the stone, but of the people who wanted it to be real. That suspicion hardened into a default position almost immediately. The stone was assumed to be a forgery designed to flatter immigrant pride, and once that assumption was locked in, the academic world stopped looking at the evidence with open eyes. Now consider the methodology, because this factor is arguably more damaging than the politics ever were. The tools needed to actually test the runestone, the Maine Penny, the iron tools, and the lake sediments did not exist in 1900. They did not exist in 1950. They barely existed in 2000. Petrographic analysis of mineral weathering as a reliable dating method matured only in the last 25 years. Metagenomic sequencing of lake sediment did not exist in any practical form until the 2010s. Three-dimensional digital imaging of rune carvings, the kind of work now being conducted alongside researchers at Uppsala University, was technologically impossible until very recently. Think about what that actually means for every verdict reached before these tools existed. The conclusions that hardened over a century ago were reached with the instruments of a century ago. They have not yet been fully retested with the instruments of today. And in science, a verdict that has never been retested is not the same thing as a verdict that has been confirmed. Then there is the quietest factor, and arguably the most powerful of all three: institutional inertia. Once a consensus is built into textbooks, museum displays, and the curriculum that trains the next generation of scholars, it takes extraordinary effort to dislodge it. The story of Meadows being the only Norse site in North America has been the foundation of Viking scholarship for over 50 years. Admitting that Norse explorers may have traveled the same rivers that French voyageurs would later paddle 600 years earlier requires the academic world to redraw a map that has been hanging on the wall for too long. That is not a small ask. It means re-examining artifacts sitting in storage labeled as forgeries. It means giving genuine credence to Indigenous oral histories that researchers spent most of the 20th century dismissing. It means admitting that the amateurs, the immigrant communities, and the Indigenous elders may have been right about something the experts may have been wrong about. That kind of institutional reckoning does not happen willingly, but it is happening anyway. New sediment cores are being pulled from lakes across the upper Midwest right now. New runic analysis is being conducted with three-dimensional imaging. New attention is finally being paid to the oral histories of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations, who remembered the strangers in boats long before anyone in a university thought to ask. The discovery is not finished. It is happening right now, and the rivers of Minnesota are not done giving up their secrets. For over a century, the academic world treated this story the way it treated every uncomfortable claim about pre-Columbian contact. Folklore, wishful thinking, something for amateurs and immigrant communities looking to romanticize their ancestry. The rivers of Minnesota kept their secret anyway. A stone carved with runes and a date. A silver coin minted for a Norwegian king. Scandinavian DNA sitting in medieval dated lake mud. exactly where the sagas said someone had been. None of it is proof. Not yet. Not by the standard history rightly demands. But the tools to finally test it properly have only existed for 15 years. Every year the technology gets sharper. Every year more sediment cores get pulled from more lakes across the upper Midwest. Every year the boundary between legend and evidence grows thinner. The Vikings did not stop at the beach. The evidence says so. And the rivers are not done talking. Subscribe for the next investigation.